So, a few years ago, following the release of Monster Hunter World's expansion, Iceborne, we had a bit of, well, the usual. Articles offering critique of what the various writers saw to be a failing in the game's narrative to properly address the subject matter in which the game based itself around. While critiquing something is perfectly fair, like 99% of online critique, it wasn't actually good. PC Gamer's Iceborne review by Sam Greer calls for sympathy for the monsters who are cruelly hunted. While the titles of Iceborne is Monster Hunter at its peak, Colonialist fantasy included, from Vice by Ricardo Contreras, and Monster Hunter World can't envision that maybe hunters are the baddies at Pace Magazine by Dia Lachina, should be a good indicator as to what the articles would entail. If you haven't read them, it wouldn't hurt to have at least some idea of what they say before I go into their talking points and critiques later. There are narrative aspects that I think are fair to critique World in, but they're not really brought up at all in these articles, all of which I think have the same core failing. When it comes to discussions of gameplay, story, colonialism, and cultural exchanges or friction, each of them comes up short in their own ways. And I like to think I get it. Having started work on this video back in January, I was able to put an amount of time into this video that someone writing a timely review just, well, wouldn't be able to. However, I do believe that people making claims from their platforms are ultimately speaking with authority, and regardless of good or bad faith, or of prior knowledge, and lack thereof, I personally try to be aware of what I don't know. I'm not perfect and I can be wrong. Casting doubt on one's own position is just basic for reinforcing that position, but in these articles that I find very flawed in so many ways, there are only statements of presumed truth. Ones that take something so basic and obvious and throw it out the door in favor of the limited perspectives of the individual writers. After all, when speaking of colonialism, a foundationally important set of interactions between many different cultures that has deeply resonant effects into the modern day, one would think that the first thing being respected is the fact that, simply in using English, we are speaking in a space largely inhabited by those coming from, or at least familiar with, a Western perspective. But in this discussion, speaking about a game that comes from Japan. A Western-flavored game made to appeal to Western audiences, yes, but still spawning from a franchise that had been one of the most popular in the country for over a decade beforehand. World shook off the last remaining jank that had carried on from the first game all the way to Generations through making more fluid gameplay and streamlining aspects like gathering materials. Put a high emphasis on graphical fidelity, moved away from being a primarily handheld franchise to major consoles and PCs, thought that they could create an endearing support character by making her unattractive and always eating, and yes, setting the game in a new world. This deliberate shift in direction led to a massive success in what was a new world for Monster Hunter. While prior entries had been exported to Western countries since the first game, gradually growing its cult fanbase, Monster Hunter World is the single best-selling game Capcom has made, successfully staking its claim in the domain of big Western console games. But these articles don't recognize or reconcile any of that. They don't see or recognize how Japanese the game is because they're not familiar with that culture in the first place, or at least not in any way applied to their critiques and readings. While understanding the Western perspective can be helpful, to proclaim ignorance within a piece of media while still coming from a place of ignorance isn't exactly what I'd call good faith, regardless of good intentions, as none of the writers actually seem to dislike Monster Hunter even if they have some issues with the framework. If anything, they love it. Greer giving the game a positive review while exclaiming about, among other things, the hot pools added in the Iceborne DLC Gathering Hall. And maybe that's a weird pivot, but as innocuous as that sounds, there's still a problem there. And if you don't see it, we should start from zero. When talking about other cultures, or in this case, their media, the first thing that needs to be recognized is that one's own perspective is from the outside. I was born and raised in the US. I know nothing about the subjective experience of growing up and living in Japan, but by recognizing that my experience is different, I aim to at least understand that which I don't. So when I see this mention of hot pools, my first thought is, hey, did you know Japan actually has a very rich culture of baths and hot springs? Which includes bathing with family, friends, or even complete strangers? It's not one I've lived, but I'm aware of it to enough of a point that I can observe this small failing, one that sees something very Japanese but can't explain it whatsoever except in beating it and bashing it into something that's recognizably Western. Hot pools. But honestly is just completely alien and unintelligible as a result, on top of not being a serviceable explanation as to why various things are labeled bath. You know, for bathing. Is it a nitpick? Yeah, but it's also one reflective of the broad failings in all of these articles. These Western sets of eyes don't reconcile their own Westernness, coming across as blind at best, and at worst, dripping with cultural imperialism. To reject a foreign point of view wholesale in service of one's own implies a sort of superiority, and at no point in any of these articles did I feel as though ears were open. Not one of these writers even trying to hear out what the franchise might be saying or the culture it comes from. So, to back up to the broad picture, even the base setting of New World becomes one we can't simply view from only a Western perspective. After all, Japan's colonial history is vastly different. Where Europe's colonization started in the mid-millennia, Japan's rapid modernization and colonial efforts occurred from the late 1800s to the end of World War II as part of a nationalist, catch-up effort to better compete with the world powers and make themselves defensible and more self-sufficient. Japan never got to the New World. Its time was spent forcing Korean and Taiwanese citizens to farm rice and alleviate Japan's resource anxiety. More comparable to what I've been raised to be familiar with as an American would be the settlement of Hokkaido to defend from possible Russian invasion, which included the subjugation and forced assimilation of the indigenous Ainu people, along with the overhunting and extinction of local animals like the Hokkaido wolf and otter. While that was a very bare-bones summary, even with just these differences it should be clear that the narrative of the game, their narratives of Japan at the time, and sense of their colonialism and settler colonialism, and the narrative the articles are reading into Monster Hunter World from a Western perspective, are massively dissonant and barely related to each other. I say narrative because colonial and settler colonial narratives are important to be aware of and critical of, but not all narratives are of equal importance. Nations don't casually erase populations of peoples without some sort of justification argued to alleviate their minds, that being a political narrative. In particular, I'd recommend giving Chapter 1 of Settler Colonialism, a theoretical overview, a look, as it shows various different methods of transfer used in settler colonial narratives to take land and resources from indigenous peoples. My use of the word narratives here in my associations not to be mistaken for the later chapter the book has on fictional narratives. So when I point out the nationalism of Japan during its colonial period, or terms like anthropocentrism brought up in the articles, that's because those are the narratives that work and it's important to be aware of them, their rhetoric, and their practice. And this does extend to fictional narratives, like the portrayal of indigenous peoples in works like Wild West films and Pocahontas. Even when it comes to allegory, when we talk about something like Avatar and observe how it places an exogenous resource-hungry military against an indigenous peoples led by a white dude, we can talk about what it's saying and how it might relate to the culture it comes from. However, if there's one thing I got out of researching colonialism for this video, it would probably be that the core of colonialism is the interactions between peoples. If we were to set these types of narratives next to each other, then the most important type of narrative would be the one espoused by large political bodies about actual peoples, with law and regulation enforcing how people must act, and actual groups of people at risk because of these narratives. They must be understood and responded to for their effect. Manifest Destiny is one of those narratives, one that used anthropocentric theism to incentivize people to settle in more Western lands at the expense of those already there. Whole peoples reduced to being mere nature to further exploit. These narratives have real and direct consequences on actual people and should be treated as such. Narratives that tell fictional stories about indigenous people will likely carry the same sentiments, but can, in theory, be used to criticize and otherwise discuss this history. They serve as a lens to the people making them and the culture they come from, and can influence the mindsets of the ignorant, such as people actually believing that the Quaalude Native American tribe might be werewolves because of Twilight. I wish I was making that up, but by being fiction their influence is much smaller and indirect. Further still is allegory, which we can certainly associate with reality, both in peoples represented and ideology espoused, but in being further distant it's far more questionable as to what effect it might have, especially in cases like, well, Monster Hunter, where real allegory for either exogenous invaders or indigenous peoples is so distant and arbitrary, I struggle with what I'm supposed to be associating with the real-life colonization and eventual settlement of the New World. Monster Hunter World doesn't have significant indigenous presence from the outset, nor is very much of the possible interaction necessary to progress the game in the first place. If the primary facet of colonialism is interactions between peoples, then, despite the Research Commission having been there for decades, the first Wyverians are exceedingly rare, and contact with the local Linean populations doesn't happen except as directed by the player. While we can observe that, in having few indigenous peoples, it might be vaguely similar to actual narratives of erasure, that's also where the relevant discourse stops. The narrative itself isn't the problem, it's the erasure, and by not portraying any actual peoples, I don't see how Monster Hunter can similarly contribute to the erasure of those actual peoples. One would have to be exceptionally ignorant and deluded to play Monster Hunter World and go, ah yes, there's barely any indigenous life here, just like America, back then. As a colonial narrative, What is Monster Hunter even supposed to be saying about any actual colonialism? Where Avatar and its white savior might alleviate some white guilt for those not critical of such a portrayal, in Monster Hunter's case there isn't any sort of meaningful peoples to allegorize. From the outset, the Research Commission is the unity of humans, elf-like Wyverians, and felines, so any attempt at a racial reading falls flat. Even the violent interactions are tamed by the game's standards, as Gajalaka and Bobo harass the player and the player can in turn, non-lethally, get them to back off. The first Wyverians might fall into a trapping of giving sage advice, being the most familiar with the land and nature of the new world, and otherwise wise, knowledgeable elder indigenous people things, but the difference in reading into a real-life narrative, a fictional narrative inspired by real life, and a fictional narrative that's only association to reality is the ideals and narrative it contains in itself, is that if the reason we should be critical of narratives is for the sake of people, then what people should we be associating world with? Colonialism has affected the entire globe, but the only part of the real-life New World mentioned by the articles is North America, even though South America was also colonized as part of the New World, which should call attention to the narrative perspective from the outset. Monster Hunter is so distant from any actual peoples that to arbitrarily associate it with reality can only really successfully point out that the game evokes the base idea of colonialism, and not one article takes it to any sort of meaningful place that can be used to help reality. The game has colonialism, is somehow handling it badly, and that's more or less all there is to get from the articles. Ones that I would say don't offer good readings for the commentary offered by the games and the ways its ideals can be applied to its real-world associations. At no point do any of the articles do more than point out that colonialism is bad, while taking surface-level points, or just incorrect ones, from the game to loosely justify their arguments. Between not actually giving any respect to the ideals it espouses, forcing it through a Western culture translator, and not trying to bring up any meaningful comparisons or links to colonialism in history that the game is supposedly justifying, just the mere idea of it, the articles failed from the outset to properly criticize its colonial narrative. And yes, I do have room to criticize World, and will do so much later after addressing the various points observed in the articles. But first, before going into the real-world ties of the concepts explored in the franchise, I feel as though it's fair to create a foundation by speaking with Monster Hunter on its own terms, observing its setting, conflict, and gameplay across the franchise to take note of what the game is aiming to say and discuss. At its fundamental core, Monster Hunter is an exploration of nature and the role humanity takes within it. This core gameplay sets the player, a human, against nature, monsters. In this unbalanced asymmetry, we see the capabilities of both sides. Monsters are incredibly powerful. Turf wars show brief clashes between monsters doing significantly more than the hunter can in the same frame of time. In line with the ecology videos in older Monster Hunter games, battles between monsters are short, brutal affairs, which should remind even an ace hunter who's hunted dozens that they are still small in the scope of the world. In comparison, to defeat a monster through the hunt, by human power, is a death by 1,000 cuts. Even an ace hunter takes an in-universe hours for any given hunt. In World, every 50 minutes you spend in the game amounts to 24 hours of time in the field. Battles are not swift affairs by any stretch. Even compared to boss battles in action-oriented games, the 50-minute time limit is extremely long, and even a third of that is still above average. If unprepared or outmatched, you'll need every minute, if you can even stand up to any of the monster's attacks. Stamina-based combat incentivizes caution, and with monsters doing massive damage, you can't trade blows with them whatsoever. So to make up the difference, by being able to last as long as you need to, both in-game and as a player, it calls attention to humanity's greatest physical quality, endurance. While numerous animals can run far faster than humans, between various evolutionary advantages and willpower, humans can run for longer. The most exceptional even better than horses. This was even used in real-life hunting to track and chase down prey until it died from exhaustion. By prolonging hunts over exceptional lengths of time, even using tracking as a core gameplay element from the beginning, paintballs evolving to tracks and glowflies, no monster can escape the persistence of a hunter, though hunters are, sadly, quite squishy. But while they are placed at odds with nature, that is not because they are outside of it. Even within nature, animals fight and kill one another for survival. Leaving monsters be can put humans at risk due to their strength, but despite that asymmetry, humans and monsters are cut from the same cloth, and bound by many of the same mechanics. When they either get tired, they eat food to recover stamina. Both are vulnerable to the same status ailments, both have elemental weaknesses, So, possessing many of the same attributes, better in willpower and endurance, but lesser in raw power and resilience, how does humanity make up the difference? Technology, of course. Through intelligence, humans can refine materials and create weapons and tools to even the odds. Through weapons and armor, humans can resist the powerful attacks of wyverns long enough to heal up, then hurt them just enough to slowly bring them down, while some monsters use tools of sorts, from improvised natural weaponry like the Carpassians appropriating shells from wyvern skulls and turning them into weapons of their own, or Atoka manipulating human-made materials to become an actual mecha pilot, a very exaggerated take on how some real animals can use tools. They cannot refine materials, they can only take from nature directly or use what humans have made. And of course, following that notion is the Hunters Guild itself. Its symbol, one very prominent in the game celebrating the franchise, Generations, is meant to carry meaning regarding humans living in nature and its cycle, explained before by developers but espoused outwardly in the recent film by its main character.
Care for nature and it will deliver prosperity. Build from prosperity to craft a thriving community. Live harmoniously in that community and teach it to always care for nature.
By acting with nature in mind, the Guild aims to protect both humans and nature by observing and managing all forms of life. Overpopulation of one species can lead to the underpopulation of others, with all requests going through the Guild. While the survival of humanity is the primary interest of humans, through the Guild they can survive without the eradication of the monsters who can easily wipe towns and civilizations off the map. In particular, the Elder Dragons. While normal monsters serve as a part of nature, the Guild able to capture them and later return them to their environment, Elder Dragons are more akin to natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, or volcanic eruptions. Quests pitting the player against Elder Dragons have no small monsters on the map. Their power is so great that the lesser life flees. In World, their arrival on the map outright changes the weather, most visible when luring them in the Guiding Lands. They cannot be captured, for humanity can't have that kind of power over nature. They can only be repelled or defeated at best, and even that is something of an impossibly difficult feat outside of the player, who, in every game, plays an exceptional, once-in-a-lifetime hunter that becomes the stuff of legend. With the Guild and its hunters serving as balancers of humanity and nature, we come to the core conflict of Monster Hunter World and Iceborne's story, specifically where the Research Commission investigates the Elder Crossing, in which Elder Dragons migrate to the New World for unknown reasons. The Commission aims to better understand the world around them, but in their scientific process is failure. In the first Zora Magdaros quest, the Commission attempts to capture the Elder Dragon, an event that leads to failure with the arrival of Nergigante. It's not until the second attempt, when they instead aim to redirect Zora Magdaros and are better prepared for Nergigante, that they are able to succeed, only repelling the monster instead of aiming to control that walking volcano. And after the continued research of the Elders, culminating in the battle with Shara Ishvalda, the Commission comes to understand their mistake. Nergigante too is part of nature and one of its balancers. It is an Elder Dragon that preys on other Elder Dragons, and very well likely could have managed the situation regarding Zora Magdaros on its own. In both instances, the prey of Nergigante may have threatened all life in the New World, but by chasing Nergigante away, the Commission ironically created more work for themselves as counterbalancers, and only after their research, efforts, and failure did they come to better understand their place in the world. Of course, their role there is only temporary, the information they can gather being finite, with the handler mentioning that the expedition will likely only last until the next Elder Crossing. While the game doesn't linger on that future of the Research Commission's relative impermanence there, to look back at Monster Hunter as a franchise, cycles and impermanence have very much been at play. The relationship between humans and nature emphasized in a cyclical emblem shows the awareness from the Guild, while even in gameplay you have the push and pull of hunters chasing monsters, the monsters fleeing only to be found again, cycles of action and rest during and between quests, day and night, or the seasons called attention to in Generations, the Fated Four, each modeled after one of them, but the most important cycle, that of humans and nature, isn't exactly shown in World. This is a new world, one that hasn't had extensive human civilization. The few wrecks and ruins you do find are all from recorded history within the lifetimes of the oldest characters. But to return to the roots of the franchise, we explore maps dotted with former civilization, ruins where man once walked and only monster remains. The most interesting part is the rust shards and ancient shards, the player uncovering and reforging weapons that can't be made by modern technology. Tri and 4 add weapons like the Switch Axe and Charge Blade, the introduction later in the franchise potentially implying a sort of technological progress relative to the prior generations. which makes sense given their relative complexity. However, even with new weapons, rusted and ancient versions of them still exist to be mined and reforged, implying that this technology isn't exactly new, but simply rediscovered. And that's interesting. Even with all of humanity's strengths, in any given quest, failure is just as much a possibility as success. While the player is likely to win, the setting extends beyond the player. Monsters and elder dragons do possess the capability to destroy civilizations. The bones above the jungle are even larger than those of the Dalamadur, serving as the later boss of Monster Hunter 4. And while one can dismiss the Monoblos and Gravios skulls on Carpassions being far larger than those of normal as a gameplay abstraction, monsters that big aren't outside the scope of the franchise, implying that what the players fight isn't the worst the world is capable of. In the wax and wane of cycles, we play the games in the wax of humanity, where the guild's ideals allow coexistence with nature, but nothing lasts forever. With these threats of elder dragons, disaster is always on the horizon. Monster Hunter Rise has since leaned into this idea even more, each map containing not just a ruin of something older that has been lost, but the relic records that detail the loss of the civilization, sometimes due to lack of respect of nature. The records about the shrine ruins describe the people living there incurring the wrath of the gods after being thankless for what they were given. The ship and bones in the Frost Islands are the result of a hunting party taking down a massive wyvern and attempting to make off with the corpse, only to be left stranded and hounded by wildlife wanting food. And this is all too fitting in a game that introduces the Rampages, the city of Kamara under a more direct threat than ever, rallying its community to prevent its own destruction. And whether it's creation, destruction, or the will to sustain, all of that is its own part in the natural cycle, of which humans are within. And maybe you think I'm looking too deeply into the goofy monster fight and make a hat game. Wouldn't be the first time I've heard the claim, but aside from that kind of remark being dismissive, it carries with it the same disrespectful sentiment carried in the articles. The title of the Paste magazine one even claiming that the franchise can't remotely envision that the Hunters Guild is bad, actually. And this particular one is really funny, because the opposite is much closer to reality. After all, you people, referring to hunters, are the real monsters. This line isn't from one of the articles, even though two of them offer very similar lines of their own. Released 3 months after the first game in the franchise, the light novel this line comes from is one that offers a more grounded look at the setting of Monster Hunter, not through the eyes of the impossibly gifted player character and all the game abstraction it comes with, but from the perspective of the more typical hunters who are considered noteworthy for being able to have successful hunts at all. And this more grounded look at the setting reveals a lot of interesting information. For example, to compare to the relic record mentioned earlier, about the crew that met their end for trying to ship an entire wyvern corpse, in the novel it's stated that the reason hunters only get so few carves is because the rest of the body is meant to be returned to nature. By letting other carnivores have the rest of the corpse, it protects herbivore populations while the wyvern is returned to the earth, those expensive materials offered to nature rather than taken for human interests. Aside from those neat little setting details, what I want to focus on is the core conflict of the novel, between the Hunters Guild, the Royal Armory, and Love Wyvern. Love Wyvern is the source of the previously mentioned line, during a chapter in which the activist group protests the main hunter character's actions fresh off of a Rathalos hunt. They disagree with the existence of hunters for killing wild animals, calling them devils while campaigning for the rights of monsters. On the other end of the spectrum is the Royal Armory, who seek to use their human wisdom to exterminate all monsters for the safety of humans, creating the Dragon Destroyers in hopes of killing the Living Mountain, Lao Shen Lung, and hope to one day exterminate any monster that might threaten humanity. At the center of the conflict and in between the two extremes is the Hunters Guild. In their debate with Love Wyvern, which admittedly has the energy of a vegan epically owning some meat eaters, hey, I'm not saying it's a well-written light novel, Elmeria, the leader of the hunting party, points out that while Love Wyvern champions the rights of wyverns, they don't care for the feelings of the animals they consume like Aptonoth or fish, hypocritically valuing some lives over others. As they claim that humans shouldn't use weapons or technology to match the more inherent capabilities of nature, Elmeria observes that this statement implies human superiority by claiming humanity should go easy on wyverns that aren't intelligent, despite their strength and natural abilities like poison or fire breath that humans don't have. Ultimately, by placing the strength of humans against those of wyverns, in a direct contest where either side can live or die, the Hunters Guild places humanity next to nature as another part of it, where Love Wyvern proclaims ethical superiority over those on the same level as nature. However, their leader does note that the Rathalos population is being overhunted, something that's very much against Guild intent, as the Guild only approves missions with observed monster populations in mind. While ultimately, Love Wyvern's ideology doesn't resist scrutiny and has unrecognized hypocrisy, they aren't framed as completely in the wrong because nature does need its defender. The reason for the overhunting of Rathalos is not the Hunters Guild, but the Royal Armory tricking hunters into accepting unapproved missions. By challenging hunters and raising legitimate issues, the guild was able to internally discuss the matter and come to realize what was happening thanks to Love Wyvern's shared interest in preserving nature. Although, shortly after the matter was called to attention, the leader of the Royal Armory, Brandar, moved to place the hunters under house arrest as he set his scheme to kill the Lao Shan Lung into action. Brandar, claiming to use human wisdom to surpass and subdue nature, ultimately shows his lack of understanding. While the dragon destroyers are powerful, in firing so many, the fire wyvern fluid they run on ends up attracting a swarm of Rathalos, something the hunters realized would happen immediately upon hearing about the plan. In their closeness to nature, they had a knowledge and understanding of it that the Royal Armory dearly lacked, the Armory only endangering themselves further for their mistake. And the destroyers didn't even amount to anything in the end, not even scratching Lao Shan Lung, their efforts vain. Ultimately, the day was saved by hunters, but what rallied them was Narumi, the leader of Love Wyvern, after she was informed of the situation by Fraudio, one of Almeria's hunting companions. Fraudio claimed he escaped house arrest because he slipped away, citing the behavior of the Gypceros as the inspiration for his actions. Fraudio is something of a deviant, loving the Gypceros to a bizarre point, but while he's certainly a weirdo, he slips from Brandar's clutches while the other hunters stay put. Where Brandar had claimed that hunters were using their human wisdom incorrectly, in Fraudio's human wisdom he learned from monsters by fighting them and respecting their capabilities to the point of taking note of them when helpful, escaping to work with Narumi to get the hunters back on track while protecting the city without it being at the expense of the Elder Dragons or the at-risk Rathalos population, everyone banding together to chase them off after Narumi posts her mission for the guild. As such, we see the ideals of the guild placed in conflict with two other human-led groups and coming out on top. The climax of the novel not about defeating nature like its antagonist wanted, but finding a way to live alongside it, stopping unhelpful human action to preserve the environment, without letting humanity be overrun or destroyed by nature either. While the individual characters and how the conflict unfolded was indeed written by the author Yuki Rin, they mentioned that what they had to work with, including the ideology of the Hunters Guild, was supplied by Capcom. This biting line about hunters being the real monsters, actually, is something that the franchise has had well in mind since its foundation, 15 years before Iceborne was even released. Now that we've established the general ideals of Monster Hunter, I aim to address the core points brought up in the aforementioned articles, starting with a major cultural misreading. Anthropocentrism is mentioned in the Paste magazine one, referring to the Christian belief that man is above nature and that nature exists for use by humans, a sentiment also brought up in the Vice article even though the term isn't used specifically. As well established, this isn't an accurate reading of the franchise by any stretch, one that places man on the same level as the nature it fights for survival. How can either writer say, in good faith, that the game presents man as being above nature, when the Commission failed to defeat Char Ishvalda and didn't understand Nergigante's role in the environment until after the fact? However, more than that, we need to look at the Shintoism that would be more immediately familiar to the Japanese players of Monster Hunter. The essay, Shinto and Ecology, brings up a few points I'd like to observe. One is that Shinto beliefs and values are deeply entrenched in Japanese folk culture in ways that expand to other areas like sociopolitics. Another is in how Japanese culture views nature not as wild, but cultured, or humanized. Historically, Japan had pushed its archipelago to stages of severe degradation before, barely, saving it with systematic human actions. Shintoism having been linked to both exploitation of resources, but also conservation. It's also believed that ritual purification is performed to establish balance between nature, humans, and deities. In observing how closely the religion is tied to culture, we can see similar connections to Monster Hunter, to the point that we see these cultural fingerprints all over the franchise. Nergigante is called a natural purifier directly by the Admiral after the events of Iceborne. Japan's environmental degradation is similar to the history of the world of Monster Hunter before the establishment of the Hunters Guild, mentioned by Julius in Legends of the Guild.
Ages ago we hunted monsters indiscriminately to the point where the natural balance of life was disrupted. The effect on our environment was devastating.
The primary audience of Monster Hunter is closer to nature simply by how the country is, and in some areas can have a deeper hand in affecting it even at just a local level. In the 1970s, Japan's largest lake had an outbreak of red tide due to the locals using synthetic soaps instead of natural ones. a soap movement occurring to regulate water quality. Humans are part of a balance with nature, capable of exploiting it, but also responsible for preserving it, with both the Commission and Nergigante being example balancers of the New World. Especially considering the size and population density of Japan, along with the relative proximity to nature, broad human action is immensely important to the environment. So Monster Hunter carries those ideals that audiences might recognize from their day-to-day life. That's not to say that Monster Hunter is without potential for criticism even with this in mind, even if the articles are way off base in their mention of anthropocentrism. In sharp contrast to what we can recognize are modern Shinto ideals, Japan's history does not exactly evoke them. As part of the Meiji Restoration, one that led to Japan's colonization of other nations for resources, and rapid development of Hokkaido at the expense of the Ainu people, Japan also adopted state Shintoism as part of a national doctrine, despite not doing much to uphold any idea of balance with nature. The essay, Sacred Forest, Sacred Nation, is also rather critical of Shintoism's history and practice, observing that despite political claims, Shintoism isn't really primarily focused on the broad-scale environment, but instead in establishing itself culturally, which does have a positive effect on the local level. If Shintoism is concerned with establishing itself as an agent of broad change, while not actually affecting anything except on a local level, then at worst, we can see Monster Hunter World as an indirect symptom. Monster Hunter's fantasy isn't as a colonial ideal, but a Shinto one, where it places these ideas on a broad, systemic level that it doesn't have in reality. I can't say this as a wholly negative thing, as they are positive ideals, even if in practice they're largely only observed on a local level, but in urban centers, Shinto's shrines might possess the only greenery nearby, the paper ending off on a note that the modern transformation of Shintoism may be making a tradition of the future, even if it's not one of the past. On the note of broad systemic influences, I want to address some points from the Paste magazine article specifically, by noting some of the desires for and criticisms against the major powers we are beholden to in the franchise, the Hunters Guild, and guild-related Research Commission and World, where Lucina wishes to see more of the effect the guild has by hunting monsters, wanting for the player to have more informatic control. While as mentioned, they aren't a fitting allegory for any real-life organizations. In the context of their game world, the guild is the largest power in Monster Hunter World, one that controls hunters and manages their actions. The writer of the article doesn't want to accept this, despite the game very much showing it. They make the claim that humans can balance nature where monsters can't, which, for the upteenth time, is directly stated to be wrong at the end of the game. Again, Monster Hunter has already well explored the ideology of the guild. In the light novel, we see their limits as they're manipulated by the Royal Armory, and have to make up for their failings. But even in the text of the game, accepting any mission requires guild approval, represented by the stamp you get on your quest form every single time. Keep in mind that while you're out and about on the hunt, every slain monster is recorded in your hunter's notes. In-universe, your hunter is keeping track of everything. Break rewards, weaknesses to status, element, weapon type, and especially important, monsters hunted. The player's effect on the environment is measured, the guild accounting for every one of these recorded actions of every one of their hunters through their approval. What Lucina mistakenly believes is that the hunter is a free agent, free to have power over nature as they wish, not recognizing or outright dismissing the guild's role in managing them. Their hopes listed at the end, about wanting the game to actually be about maintaining balance, basically just means they want to play the person behind the counter giving you the missions and keeping track of what hunters are doing, not wanting to play as the hunter. But supplemental media often does look at this element. Poaching, hunting done outside of the guild or commission's recognition, is a major plot point of the light novel, comes up in Hiro Mashima's Monster Hunter O Rage, and gets an offhand reference in Legends of the Guild. The game mechanics don't break from the guild's methodology as a mechanical abstraction to show how an ideal hunter acts through the player, and these ideas have been explored before. The only actual gameplay change that could be added to address this with the setting in mind is to just say you can't hunt certain monsters sometimes. Something like the Generations Hunt of the Day that gives you bonus rewards for hunting certain monsters, but in reverse, not allowing you to hunt one monster due to the effects of other hunters. Aside from not being a fun, interesting, or engaging gameplay mechanic, it would only be there to account for something already there in the text. Why do games so eagerly dive into colonialism? The article opens with, to which I answer that colonialism is a foundationally important part of modern culture, and art is our way of exploring that in a safe environment. And yes, Monster Hunter World is a piece of art, one that uses abstraction to get across its ideas, like any. Where this might have been too much of a hurdle for these critics is in reading games and their diegesis. I know they recognize the abstraction at work. They have to. Why mention the plundering of resources in the Vice article if, In the game itself, you just mine at these magic rocks that appear and disappear from the same spots. It's not literal, it's game abstraction. Yet these readings are overly convenient, picking and choosing what elements to abstract and which ones to take literally. For instance, missions are repeatable, from a typical Puki Puki hunt to the redirection of Zora Magdaros. The quest description never changes. This one is about hunting a Radobon so a researcher can recover their life's work. Are they losing their papers every time you need to repeat this quest to hunt a Radobon? No, it's a gameplay abstraction. Just like how there's only one amazing hunter, even if you hunt with other players who are also that exact same one amazing hunter. Doing missions once each makes more sense than having them be endlessly repeatable. Yet none of the articles even try to reconcile this. Comparing how mining works in Monster Hunter, as opposed to, say, RTS games that have you exhausting pools of resources for the means of war, you are one hunter and resources never run out. Not because they are inexhaustible, but because the actions of one hunter and one small settlement cannot match up to the modern industry of nations. The appearance of infinite resources or creatures is the guild at work. They manage things to keep populations of monsters from falling, while at the end of the day, one single person can't have a dramatic effect on the environment. None of the other commission hunters are close to the level of your Sapphire Star, and I think the swarm of Legiana at the start of Iceborne is a good indication as to just how many monsters roam the new world. In trying to equate a small research commission of a few dozen people, 100 or so at most, to the broad industrialization of colonial America is absurd. The fleet doesn't appear to engage in agriculture, Lachina notes, forgetting how massively farming transforms the environment, and how antithetical that would be to preserving nature in the new world for an expedition that's not going to last 10 more years. Humans being able to balance nature and mitigate the effects of their actions isn't even just some made-up concept. For example, Japanese forests going unmanaged has led to landslides, while the California wildfires can potentially be stemmed with human action taken to remove fallen trees. What is a hurricane-proofed building if not human technology being used to mitigate natural disaster? While Monster Hunter takes that abstract to the absurd point of being able to fight off a physical hurricane in the form of Kushla Daura, the idea is still there. But we also culturally recognize the value of protecting endangered species. The idea of killing these creatures not sitting well with some, such as Greer, the writer of PC Gamer's Iceborne review, where they admit to not liking that they have to invade the territory of and kill big monsters, citing the cruelty of the game.
I like Monster Hunter, but I can't play it because it makes me sad to hurt the cool monsters, especially when they try to limp away. It is too much.
For one, I want to note that the reverse is also true. Many missions are the result of monsters getting too close to humans and human settlements. And if you don't think that justifies killing so many monsters, well, good news, you don't need to. At the beginning of the world, it stated that capturing monsters allows for a complete hunt, while later having the monsters return to the environment. This is only not an option against a select few monsters, the Elder Dragons in particular, and it actually has multiple benefits in the form of faster hunts and more rewards. There's no downside whatsoever to capturing monsters temporarily instead of killing them, yet at no point do any of the articles mention this. Every single one of them complains about killing monsters, so none of the players felt like, even once, learning how to capture monsters and expend a relatively small amount of resources to get even more rewards and get through the game quicker. And if they did know, then that is textbook bad faith criticism, deliberately misrepresenting the game and what it incentivizes the players to do for the sake of the narrative they want to push. However, what strikes me is just how utterly ignorant of reality this is. Given the commonality of using poison and traps to kill pests, I just want to note that reality is far crueler than Monster Hunter World. Please, don't buy a glue trap unless you want to see a mouse desperately trying to escape to the point of having ripped its own leg off in a fruitless attempt to get free. In Monster Hunter, you don't have to kill baby animals. In Pest Control, you probably will. But I think more interesting and relevant is that idea of some lives being more important than others. After all, we do culturally accept a lot of animal death for a human quality of life. To go back to Love Wyvern, in just saying, don't do anything to manage the population of animals, we are still making value judgments. To use a real-life example, I want to bring up culling mountain lions to protect ungulate populations. Some lives are more sacred than others. A paper which examines the ethical dilemma while comparing different state efforts to manage mountain lion populations. The key point here is that mountain lions are predators that need to kill other animals to survive, and not managing their populations can put endangered animals at risk. California's no sport hunting mandate of mountain lions having a direct effect on locally endangered bighorn sheep populations. Ultimately, the essay concludes that different regions have different needs, and that there is no one-size-fits-all method for mountain lion population control, which I think is an example of the ideology of Monster Hunter applying to real life. Inaction is a choice, and the Hunters Guild takes action as a balancer, but in doing so must inherently make judgments on individual lives. To wholesale take on Love Wyvern's ideology is to potentially endanger certain animal populations or humans and their settlements. Not because all lives matter, just the ones that we feel like at the time. Chameleos just kind of makes people disappear, so naturally, since it is a rare animal, the response should be,
really an important species we're dealing with, and I don't think that you or I or anybody has the right to arbitrarily exterminate them.
It's easy to see the killing as cruel and senseless from the perspective of one who doesn't have to deal with animals threatening other lives, like those in the setting of Monster Hunter. And the last major point I want to address, in the Vice article, there's a claim about the Volcana. We are all part of nature, the field team leader says. Contreras arguing that these lines are in justification of self-interested settlers staking claim in the New World. In effect, the peak colonialist fantasy. But what I can't understand is how they came to this conclusion. To explain the scene, Volcana is outside of its typical habitat in the Hoarfrost Reach, freezing life in the New World to death in a rampage. The Commission, without guild approval from the mainland, is prepared to leave. The core conceit of the article, in that the choice to stay and fight is based in self-motivated, settlement-centered interests, is completely off the mark. That's the thing, this is a temporary assignment. The Commission is going to leave later, so with the threat of Volcana freezing over the entire continent, why not leave sooner? If human life is more valuable than natural life, and if nature is just going to run its course, then they shouldn't risk their lives to affect things. That choice to do nothing is the self-interested one, a choice of self-preservation at the expense of nature. The field team leader is the one who counters this. Having been born on the continent, to him, this is his home, the only place he's been a part of as nature, and rather than see it destroyed, he'd rather risk his life to defend it. This scene isn't about colonialism, it's about humans choosing to risk their lives to preserve nature, rather than see it annihilated by another force of nature they've been unable to contend with up to this point. How Contreras came to believe this was about colonialism is in such bad faith, I just can't understand it. While the claim of bad faith from these writers I still believe are acting in good intentions may come across as a bit harsh, the bad faith comments like this are something I just can't handwave. Monster Hunter World isn't beyond criticism. As mentioned before, it portrays something closer to the ideal of Shintoism as a body more powerful than it is in reality. However, in the game's framework of reaching out to a new world, while the history of the country is one distant from the actual colonization of the New World, I do want to note another idea the game may tie to certain broader ideas. After all, Japan is heavily criticized for its revisionist history regarding its past failings or even war crimes. Behind this is a nationalist agenda, one that involves not adequately addressing its past. So when I observe that modern Shintoism doesn't actually match history, it should be noted that history isn't necessarily taught accurately, and by reducing past ills for nationalist reasons, a population that isn't wholly aware of what its nation can be capable of would reasonably make art that matches that nationalist identity. Gate, from the 2 seasons of the anime that have been adapted from the original light novel, very much presents the Japanese colonizer as ideal in ways not matched by their history with Korea and Taiwan, even relative to more resource-hungry foreign powers, often presented as greedy and sinister. Even though the Japan of Gate still has the modern resource anxiety, they're also rational and have yet to exploit their power imbalance to take resources from the fantasy world. In that kind of nationalism we might loosely associate Monster Hunter World, which might be read as a message of more superior Shinto ideals in comparison to the Christian ones that Western culture colonized the New World with. But that observation is one I can't say in good faith without a much more solid foundation of knowledge regarding Japanese education, regarding the nation's history of imperialism and what's commonly taught, and overall a better understanding of Japan's media landscape with that knowledge in mind. Monster Hunter World is just a small part of the whole, one so distant from any reality that I wonder how many, or how few, minds it might have influenced at all. And that influence is one far removed than any criticism offered in the articles. Admittedly, if there is one failing of Monster Hunter World, it's that it takes too much for granted. In serving as a cultural bridge between East and West, clearly Western critics weren't prepared for something so foreign despite it seeming so familiar. Perhaps Capcom could have stood to re-examine the ideals of the Hunter Guild in a conflict built from the ground up. Love Wyvern and the Royal Armory might be old hat to a superfan, but to a game that gains so many new players, it's all very fresh. While I think it spells a lot of what it's doing outright, the article is not even acknowledging some major context from the end of the game, what I understand and know of the franchise is in part due to my 12-year history with it. But I'm still of the mindset that people should recognize that their perspective isn't infallible, and that they should aim to be open-minded. The deepest irony of the articles is that in their ignorance of other cultures, despite being critical of the history they know, shroud and disguise their cultural imperialism with what I can't help but read as Western colonial guilt, making me wonder why a Japanese game should bear the cross of educating its Western audience on Western colonialism, when it's much more interested in a backbone of Shintoism. There's no better way I can summarize the failing of these articles than the tendency of present reckoning with racism and colonialism to view the past through the experiences of the English-speaking world, often to the exclusion of all else. Thanks for watching the video. This one's a little different from my usual fare. After Action Button's Tokimeki Memorial video, I was inspired to try doing content that takes more time and research. And this is the first video to come out of that. If you liked it and want to see more, then I would recommend you consider supporting my Patreon. Aside from the end of video shoutouts, if you contribute to the highest tier, you can pick something for me to watch or read, provided it wins the monthly poll, and I will guarantee do a video on it, usually a little vlog. Even if you don't want to contribute to the highest tier, only patrons can vote on what I check out each month. But most importantly, by supporting my Patreon, you'll be helping me keep longer videos like this coming. On that note, I would like to end off thanking my patrons: Justice Man, Dojo32161, Ninetails, Bro Rike, Muhammad Akeem, Flarbu, Bayanort, Sam Bellmeyer, Tengoon, Offline But Not, and Brian Nesseth. Thank you for watching.